I'm just going to, I guess maybe what we can take away from this next example, as I'm sure you could have imagined for yourself, um, you know, we don't just have to generate data using like np dot, give me a normal distribution or simulating dice. We can also read in data from a file. So we practiced that last week. So I'm just going to, looking at activity 3, if you want to follow along, I'm going to download this montana.txt file, and maybe I will open it just to take a look at what's in there. What do I want to open with? Text edit, that's fine, probably. Okay, and so I see in here, looks like I've got a pretty simple file that just has years and then some other value. This turns out to be population. And so I have this input file here, montana.txt. Oh, okay. And then if I download montana.py, save that up, and then I'm just going to open that. So here again, I just have my main that's going to execute my program, but I have this read file function that's going to read. So that population data came from the U.S. Census, and so we can see here that using the same file syntax that we've been practicing, this just opens up the file and actually creates those NumPy arrays that we're going to plot. And maybe I'll just run this and we can see what's happening. Well, we get that yearly, or I think it's decade by decade census data, and we see the population overall increasing. And so if we take a closer look here, one thing I want to point out is that this is something we haven't seen before, but we're calling this read file function on the name of our file. That's very familiar. But what's actually happening here is that read file is returning two, I guess, in this case they're NumPy arrays, but previously we've only seen our functions giving us back one return value. Whether it could be an object, sometimes we're returned an object, we can be returned an integer, we can be returned a list, but we haven't seen this sort of shorthand of getting back a variable years and a variable populations before. And this is just kind of Python being clever and concise and just unwrapping this list here for us. We see this return is returning us actually a tuple and a list. So Python is sort of cleverly unwrapping this, and it actually turns out, I think if I take away this list, this will also run. Let's just try it out. Yeah. So so this is sort of a clever thing that can happen, but this is exactly the same thing as if we said something like result is read file of montana.txt, and then I'm going to say years is result at 0, and populations is result at 1. And I'm just going to comment this out and just verify that all that's happening in this line where we're getting two things back from read file is Python is just being clever and doing this all in one line. Sound good? Great. So we're just pulling this up to see, okay, we've got, we're plotting years versus populations. If I just comment out this second line here, I can see what the first line is doing. So maybe I can try to get some sense from the call. So we're passing red from the R, and this O will tell us that it circles. So let's just run this. And we see, okay, so that line was just plotting the circles. And now if I add back in the second line, here we're using this full word black for the color. If I tried black dash to say, okay, give me black line, or give me color black, and use the dash meaning make it a line, if I run this, I get an error, and that's because I can only use these shorthands together. So I'd have to do B dash if I wanted to use the shorthands. So now this will work. Ooh. Oh, I guess, okay, B is not black, B is blue. So I can also use the full word black. And these are also, I would say, kind of like Matplotlib or Python kind of being clever, and you kind of just have to look at the documentation if it's confusing, like, okay, why is B dash giving me a blue line, and then now I have to like type out the whole word black. Look at the documentation and mess around with it is, I would say, my answer. And then the last thing, or one thing to point out here, like I said earlier, so I see that I have a Y label, but when I actually run this, I lost it. When I actually run this, I don't see my Y label. And if I am confused about that, which is reasonable, I can just increase the sort of white space on the left. Oops, I didn't want to reset. And now I see my Y label as population. So here's a command we haven't seen yet. So this plt.figure. Did anybody see where this like came up, like just as a hint of like what's happening to figure out what this plt.figure command is doing? Let me run it again. Yeah, so we saw it. If you hopefully have this on your screen in case you can't see this small text, but so what happened here is we're actually naming, so the sort of big picture of Matplotlib is we're creating kind of this, like, you could think of it as like a figure object. And here we're saying, okay, work on figure 1, or work on this first figure, and actually let's give it a name. So this is, we're not going to go in depth into sort of how Matplotlib works, but if it helps you to think about it this way, you can kind of think of this as like setting, okay, for this figure that we're working on, we're kind of setting, like, maybe I'll say, set name of figure to historical populations. And so that's what this is doing. Like, kind of like, it's like analogous to when we were making our own classes, and maybe we like we gave our class a name, right? We said, oh, this instance will have, this dog will have this name. So it's kind of like setting the name of the figure that we're working on to that. And so that's why the name of this window here is historical Montana populations. If we didn't do this, we can see what happens. Now we just get figure 1 because that's the default. So the sort of default name is just figure 1. If we made another one, a second one, it would have name figure 2, etc. And I guess just because, so this is referenced in the description of program 6. So is there anything that we noticed from this plot? Now putting on our sort of like data analysis hats instead of our programmer hats, what might we sort of notice about this data? If I had to make a list of like things I now know about the Montana population, since this is what you're going to have to do, things we can observe from plot. This is what you're going to have to turn in something like this for program 6, so we might as well practice. So what's one thing we could observe, even if it's simple? Yeah, so Montana population generally increases over time. Maybe all. Okay, so that's a good observation. What else? Sure, we could maybe make that claim. Like what part would you say is linear? Yeah, definitely positive. I don't know. If I were like, this seems like it's maybe even exponential to me. And then maybe like this is linear. I'm not sure. But we could describe like, you know, we could make, okay, I guess I would say it's potentially linear from like 1950 to 2020, but I would not say that this one was linear. So maybe I won't put it down. Sorry. Anything else?
Like early 1900s, there's like huge in-migration, then flattens off,
Yeah.
decreases. I don't know if that,
Yeah, we'll say
is that
nine.
like depression time, or is that like dust time?
Yeah, so we could say there's like definitely I would maybe even say you could this kind of looks like exponential growth 1880 to 1920, and then what happens 1920 to maybe we'll say 1940, there's maybe even decline flat or declining, and this is Great Depression and Dust Bowl era. World War II, yeah. Great Depression, Dust Bowl, yeah. World War. Let's say World War. And then, yeah, we might say something like, and then growth, maybe in 1950 on. Yeah. So that would be for program 6. You're going to need to create 2 plots about this like aviation data set, and you'll have to provide, so this would be sort of like too rough. I think it says in the description, you know, like a nicely written up 2 insights about the data that you can get from the plot, but these would be completely acceptable insights, sort of this big picture one maybe, that generally we see an increase in population over time, but more specifically maybe describe how at different time periods. And if you want to guess, maybe you know something about aviation, or maybe you want to make a guess about why you're seeing this trends you see, you can do that. But you'll need to make 2 sort of observations for each of your 2 plots. So I just want to show an example of that.